Okay. If you still need to join, that code's going to stay in the upper right-hand corner. Please enter it as soon as you can. We left off yesterday talking about material culture as tangible things that we can see and touch, that are manufactured. They might have been made in a factory like a car or the car of a subway train, but it's also anything else that's manufactured. When my 4-year-old draws me a picture, which she always draws me a picture, and then when she sees her mother, she's like, "Oh, Mommy, I made this for you." I have no pictures by the time this is done. Those are manufactured things too. Where we pick up with today's notes is on non-material culture, which is the intangible stuff. We can't touch it. We can't directly see it. We can infer it, but that's it. It includes several things. We'll kind of introduce these with examples from what we've already looked at, and then we'll dive a little deeper. So it can be ideas. The scene of the traffic jam that we saw yesterday, and it's up there in the upper right-hand corner today, it's a traffic jam in one of the places most famous for traffic jams, California. Those scenes reflect American individualism. And we have traffic jams because there are more cars than people in this country, and Americans tend to like to drive if at all possible. And many times, what's that? Yeah, I think we did cross that point where there are more cars than people. Or maybe it's guns. I could be confusing guns and cars.
I wouldn't be surprised.
We do have like 39 more guns than people.
I'll have to fact check that. But I think I did also.
Fact checking it on my computer.
No, not the guns thing, the cars thing. You can fact check the cars thing. But I think I did hear that we crossed that threshold too. Although it is harder, it was and is harder for me to believe. So I'm prepared to be wrong about that one, Will. But that's what traffic jams reflect. If you drive in California, or even if you just go to St. Louis, and has anybody seen one of those HOV lanes? Any special lane that's usually marked with a diamond? Okay. Brody, you've seen those? What do you have to do to drive in that lane? It's almost always empty, right? Even at rush hour, what do you have to do to get to use that magical empty lane?
I mean, I never really got to drive, but I see a bunch of people go through it.
Yeah, they'll go through it. To drive in that lane, the HOV stands for high occupancy vehicle, which might have meant at one time several people in a car. But this is America, and it is very hard to pry people out of their own car and get them to ride with someone else. And so now, for most places, high occupancy means 2 people in a car. That's how hard it is to get Americans to do things like carpool, right? Because most people just don't want to do it. Yeah, it will.
It's about half as many cars as there are.
Half as many cars as people. Okay, I'm glad to know.
Probably the guy.
No, I'm always okay with being wrong. I would rather be correct than confident about saying the wrong thing. So half as many cars as people. Okay, it was the guns that outnumber the people. I know that one's true. All right. So traffic jams reflect individualism. And Americans will do crazy things to use those high occupancy vehicle lanes, even though there's only one person in the car. They'll put dummies in the passenger seat, right, to try and fool the cops into thinking there's another person in the car. And sometimes there are cameras to try and enforce those lanes. It also reflects values. In other societies, like the image we saw from Japan of people crowded onto a train, might be that there's a value that public transit is environmentally the right thing to do and what people should use. I don't know why there's a greater than less than sign there, by the way. So you don't need to put that in your notes. And also beliefs. And a lot of times, again, beliefs, I'll say this several times just because it often doesn't stick immediately. They're not just things we think of as beliefs, like believing in ghosts or having religious beliefs. It can be very basic stuff, like driving on the right-hand side of the road. It's a belief about how driving should be done. We don't think much about it, but if we visit a country where the steering wheel is on the other side of the car and people drive on the other side of the road, right, then we become very aware of our own beliefs. And it can be uncomfortable. Certainly, for most of my driving life, I've driven a manual transmission, and the idea of shifting gears with my left hand would take some getting used to. We also have, as our final thing, attitudes. I will tell you, attitudes and beliefs can be hard to distinguish. So I'm not going to test you over these things that you have to distinguish them.
Did you get the thing anyway?
I did. I haven't had time to open it.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Sure. Attitudes are kind of more basic things than beliefs. You might almost think of them kind of as like an impression. And in this case, do people accept being crowded onto a train? The consensus I got very clearly from the class yesterday is no. In this country, you are not going to crowd people into a train.
Then why they do it over there is because if they had that many cars, they would have the same issue.
Right. Well, that's like Tokyo is where that subway scene was from. Tokyo is enormous. And yeah, you can't do this kind of American style driving in Tokyo.
Unless you want a line of cars about 50 miles long.
Yeah. Or, as an attitude, do people reject that in favor of just basically feeling that the thing that's most comfortable and that we're most willing to do is drive alone? Let's take a kind of more systematic look at those things. And we'll start with values. Values are standards within a culture. Standards, on the one hand, of what is inherently good. Right? It's not good because it leads necessarily to good things. It's good because it just is. Right, we accept it as good or valuable, and we accept it as important. In the United States and a lot of other Western countries, a key value is that democracy is good. In and of itself, democracy is good. It's the right way to pick leaders. It's the right way to run a government. It may not always be the most efficient. It may not always produce the outcomes we want, but that's okay. Democracy is good all by itself. And because of that, we believe that elections are important. Values are also about what is proper or appropriate, and what is fair or just. And so what is our sense of what constitutes justice? In terms of what's proper, how much economic inequality should a society tolerate? Different societies have very different answers. American society tends to be much more accepting of economic inequality. And if you think back to that video, one of the videos we watched when we considered America's middle class, the one commentator said that unfairness is good. It's not a problem in the system. It's a feature of the system. Other societies don't see it that way. Related to that is a question of justice. Is it just? Is it fair to take wealth away from a group that has it to give it to another group in order to make things more equal. Our society tends to say no. In America, if you want to not do so well in politics, you should talk about redistributing wealth. It's often not a popular pair of words. But in a country like Denmark or the Netherlands, you have really high taxes that tend to make the gap between the rich and the poor smaller. We've spent a fair amount of time on beliefs, but again, this is where often tricky for people, so it's probably a good thing that we do. Beliefs are a couple of things. One, they're what people believe is true, and that's where, it can be a belief about religion, or whether ghosts exist, or whether UFOs really are space aliens. But it doesn't have to be those things. The American dream is a belief system. And the truism for this, in general, I've asked students in different classes over the years what they thought the American dream meant. And the consensus kind of circled around this. But this has also been kind of the way it's framed in the United States in most of the national political discussion for about 15 or 20 years now. I'm not saying it wasn't that before, but this has been kind of explicitly what politicians say. If you work hard and play by the rules, then you will be successful. Or for some politicians, they say you should be successful if you do those things. And if you do those things and you're not successful, then something else is wrong. And belief systems also are kind of mental models for how the world works. And the American dream is, again, an example we can use for this. A lot of people, based on the belief in the American dream, upon seeing someone who is not successful, believe that if that person has not succeeded, then they did at least one thing wrong. Either they didn't work hard, or they didn't play by the rules, and perhaps they didn't work hard or play by the rules. I'm not saying that all Americans think this way. I'm not saying it's bad if you do think this way. There's no judgment here at all. But that is a common conclusion based on a belief system, based on the American dream belief system, I should say. We've covered two of the big ones, values and beliefs. Now I want to shift gears. And I said, guys, we're covering a lot of ground today. I know that's not always the easiest thing, but I appreciate you guys bearing with me. We need to distinguish when thinking about a society's culture between its ideal culture and its real culture. Ideal culture is what we would, think of as a postcard scene. Thank you. He is not here. Sorry.
Okay.
So ideal culture is what we would want our society to be like, and what we would want other people to think our society is like. Now, before someone thinks that I'm picking on America, talking about the American dream, and calls Tucker Carlson to say they found another Blame America First guy, I'm not. And let's pick on the Soviets because, you can always pick on the Soviets. This is America, and nothing to do with Russians right now seems to be very popular. And so they're a good whipping boy for this. That's not why I use them. Actually, I use them because there's a very good example of ideal versus real culture from the Soviet Union. The Soviet ideal was reflected in propaganda, And the Soviets were really good at propaganda. They showed it to their own people to try to convince them what life was like, and they also showed it to the rest of the world to convince us that Soviet communism was superior. They did that in lots of elements. We're going to focus on food. Right? So in the propaganda, the ideal culture, we see that there's plenty of food. There's dairy, there's meat, and those are the most expensive kinds of food. There's just so much that we can just pour it out of giant milk pails. And it's good. It is high quality, appetizing food. The reality was very different. And that is real culture, the way our society actually is. And in the Soviet Union, that reality was mostly there wasn't a lot of food. This scene is kind of a screen grab from a video someone shot of a Soviet supermarket in the final days of communism. Most of the shelves are empty. When a box of things shows up, people go immediately to the box, right, form a line, try and get what they can. But even in that situation, a lot of the food is so unappealing that people don't take it with them. In this scene, we've got what's supposed to be a refrigerated or freezer aisle with meat in it. But the meat is poorly packaged. It's not clear that the refrigeration unit is working. And so a lot of people just give it one glance and leave it alone. One person picks it up, sniffs it, and quickly puts it back. It's not good, right? It's not plenty, and the food is not delicious. So always make sure that we're clear that real culture and ideal culture don't always match, right? Whether we're talking about the American dream or communism.
Mr. Barbosa said politicians only care about losing my time.
Well, there's that. We're going to now look at cultural universals. Right, as we run through our grab bag of the basics. As I said, be careful with universals. On the face of it, they make perfect sense. It sounds very simple. They are cultural things that all societies share. And we've got lots of examples of these. One is music. All societies, cultures have music in one form or another. And one of the things that music does is convey emotion. It can make you scared. It can make you feel happy. It can make you feel angry. What shows us the universality of music is that people can pick up the emotion in a musical piece even if they're not familiar with that style. And we know this because studies have been done on cultures that were isolated, right? Societies that were isolated from other societies and other cultures. And they played music those people had never heard before, styles that were not familiar, instruments that were not familiar, languages they didn't understand. And yet, people were really good at identifying the emotion conveyed by the music. And again, every culture has music. The forms can be different, but they all have it. Another universal is family. All societies, cultures have a concept of the family group. In American culture, that concept has been the nuclear family, which is kind of an unfortunate name for it because we talk about the nuclear family at about the same time that we have the first nuclear weapons. So different things, different uses of the word nuclear. The idea of the nuclear family is the married parents and the kids, and that's it. They live under a roof, but that's it. No grandparents, aren't aunts living with you. When the kids grow up, they go off, they form their own nuclear families. That's it. In other societies, the cultural concept of the family group is broader and involves sometimes more than 2 generations, more than 3 generations, I should say, living in the same household. We'll have the parents and kids as 2 generations, and we may also have grandparents. In some cases, we might have several different members, some of them being mothers and fathers of children living in the house, all living together.
You don't see too many families like
No, not many, although so typically when we think about this, to the extent that there are deviations from that concept in America, it's grandparents living with with their grandchildren and their children.
You don't see too many families like the one from Hawaii.
No.
That one's a pretty extreme example, but
Right. And there's a potential for some change in the United States. There was a conservative writer, David Brooks. Some people don't consider him a real conservative, but anyway, that's beside the point. He wrote an article called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." I discussed all the ways that it was wrong and it messed things up in America. That's not a debate we can settle here and now. So let's move on to smiling.
damn.
All right. Smiling is definitely a cultural universal. It is, really, smiling looks the same everywhere. Families may look different, music may sound different, but smiles are the same, and they're understood in all cultures. But they can also include differences that change the meaning of a smile, at least in some contexts. And apologize for this in advance. This would be much better if I could show you the movie clip that went along with this story instead of telling you. But Clint Eastwood's character is carrying a beer bottle visibly throughout the whole thing, so I can't. All right. I know you guys could take it. It's the people that decide whether I get a paycheck now and a contract for next year that feel differently. It's a movie called Gran Torino. Some students may have seen it, but really not many of my students have seen it, and that's been true for several years. In this movie, Clint Eastwood's character plays a Polish-American Marine veteran who has lived in a neighborhood that typically had a lot of other people like him. But time has passed. He lives alone. His wife has died. And a lot of the people around him that were his neighbors have either died or moved away, and new people are moving in. And they don't look like him. They're not from European cultures. Some of them are new to America. And he feels pretty uncomfortable. His newest neighbors in the movie are a multi-generational Hmong family. The Hmongs are people mostly from Vietnam, Laos, mountainous areas. I think mountainous areas. Maybe I'm thinking of the Montagnards. But anyway, they're from that area. They were opposed to the communists in the Vietnam War. They fought on the side of the United States. And when we lost, we took a lot of them out with us so that they wouldn't be persecuted. These people move in next door. Clint Eastwood's character is not real happy about it. But one of the young family members tries to befriend him and convinces him to go to a party. And he goes to this big family party, and he's uncomfortable, but he's trying to be positive about it, and he sees a little boy. And he pats the little boy on the head, and everything stops. Not in like a magical way, like a freeze frame kind of way, but everybody stops. They notice, right? They are shocked that he has patted a child on the head. In Hmong culture, that is an offensive thing that you do not do. Clint Eastwood doesn't know what's happened. He sees that people are all of a sudden not happy with him, and he responds by becoming angry. And as he becomes angry, all of these Hmong people start smiling at him. Not just smiling, but like grinning at him. how would you feel if you were like uncomfortable and angry, and all of a sudden people are grinning at you as you're becoming more uncomfortable and more angry? You'd be more angry. Yes, this is going to escalate things. Were they smiling at him like that because they were mocking him? No. In their culture, one thing is you don't touch people's heads. And two, when you're in an uncomfortable, awkward, tense situation, you smile. They're not doing it to upset him. They're not doing it to make fun of him. Smiling has a different and extra meaning in Hmong culture. And so smiling, while perhaps the most universal of universal cultural things, is also not identical from culture to culture. Well, actually, because that was supposed to happen, but it didn't. So as I make changes, sometimes things go wrong. That's all right. All right. And our final thing, I promise this is the final thing in our marathon survey of different elements of culture.
I feel like you're talking about it more than one thing.
No, I am too. Subcultures versus countercultures. I don't mean in like a battling kind of way, but the differences between the two. Right. To start this off, I want you to consider both of those images. Right. And I want you to tell me which one you think is the clearest example of a subculture and which is the clearest example of a counterculture, right? And why you think so.
Oh, is this a part?
This is a Pear Deck thing. And again, I know just as with material and non-material culture, I haven't defined a subculture or a counterculture. I want you guys to shoot from the hip, as it were, and do the best you can. Set a timer for a minute. When that's up, I'll add 30 seconds. If you're wondering about the exit slip, there's not going to be one.
Did you add 30 seconds?
Not yet. Not yet. This is still that initial minute.
Why don't you just do a minute?
Because it doesn't let me.
Counterculture smashed together.
That's all right. You guys give from a quick survey, you guys are doing very well. Now, what we see, you guys are more evenly divided than Fourth Hour was. Lots of explanations for the top picture being a subculture, right? And the bottom picture being a counterculture. And it's not that I don't care about the explanations, but showing them isn't as essential as it sometimes is. And it turns out, in fact, that guy, despite looking cartoonish, you might even say freakish, represents a subculture. Right? Whereas the people, one of whom students in the past have thought I dress very much alike. Matter of fact, I've had students ask me if I'm Amish. There are lots of reasons why I clearly am not, but let's set that aside. Right? Whereas the Amish represent a counterculture. Okay. And to help understand why, we'll define the two. So a subculture is a smaller cultural group within the larger mainstream culture that virtually all members of a society share. So they're different. Okay, and Mr. Juggernaut down there certainly is different. The members have their own group identity. There was another thing that was supposed to have been different. I'm not sure what's going on with Google Slides today.